Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I want to talk about the new movie John Wick Chapter 4. I know it's a bit of a late release on the review for this film, but I've enjoyed the John Wick series up until this point, so I had to go check it out. The synopsis is as follows. With the price on his head ever increasing, legendary hitman John Wick takes his fight against the high table global as he seeks out the most powerful players in the underworld. So without further ado, let's get into the 6 things that make a movie great. 1. The plot. When we come into this movie, John Wick has been training in the underground, given safe passage by the Bowery King after having been betrayed by Winston. At this point, he's back up and running, and while seeking revenge, he also is trying to find a way out. The High Table decides to send some new players in to eradicate him, and he has to work his way through all of the assassins and hitmen to get to the top, challenge the High Table, and earn his freedom. I guess for me, the plots of the John Wick movies have gotten more and more convoluted as the series has gone on. For me, it honestly felt like watching a video game, because it kind of was like, John, okay, you have to do this. Okay, well, in order to do this, you have to go to this, and then you have to talk to this person who wants you to do this before you can get from them what you're wanting to get from them. And it just seemed like a video game plot with a bunch of side quests and a boss fight at the end. And while the action was cool, because the story was lacking, dare I say the movie was a little bit boring for me? He said timidly in order to not be killed by his subscribers. I've always thought that the John Wick movies had way more potential than they actually ended up using, and this movie was proof of that. So while the story was mildly entertaining, for me it didn't have much to do with the plot. So for me, plot gets a 50-50. 2 is family friendliness. I don't need to talk about this much, but I'll mention it briefly. Just for kicks. The John Wick movies are insanely violent. While there wasn't as much action in this one as there was in Parabellum, there still is quite a bit of action, lots of death, lots of blood, lots of brutal killings, and a moderate bit of profanity. But still not family friendly in the least, so family friendliness gets a thumbs down. 3 is acting and script. First and foremost, just wanted to say that it was really sad to see Lance Reddick's passing. I know how much he meant to the cast and crew, and I really enjoyed him in these films. That being said, he wasn't in this movie for longer than 5 minutes. Keanu Reeves is so familiar with the character of John Wick that it almost seemed like his performance kind of got overshadowed by some of the new interesting characters that were introduced. Characters like the blind assassin named Kane. Wonder how they came up with that name. I've really enjoyed Donnie Yen's performances in the past, and he fit right into this dark assassin universe. I also really liked Rina Sawayama as Akira, and Ian McShane as Winston. And the script of this movie was okay. I mean, you're not going to see a John Wick movie for the inspirational dialogue, but I think between the story writing being kind of subpar, even though you have an incredible universe at your fingertips, and the fact that you have these new characters being introduced, I guess I thought that the dialogue and character interactions would be a little bit better than they were. John Wick is not a very outspoken person, so obviously it's going to be a lot of one-word responses and deadpan dialogue, but there were a couple witty moments here and there, and it was enjoyable for the most part. So for me, acting and script get a thumbs up. 4 is character development. At this point, we know enough about John Wick to where we don't need a ton of character development with him, although like I mentioned before, it kind of seems like the other characters just kind of overshadow him and his performance and even his character at times. You do get some mild character development with Kane, which is one of the reasons why I liked his character, because they did a really good job balancing his feelings and emotions mixed with his professionalism in the assassin world, because quite often those lines are crossed and he has to make decisions that he doesn't want to make, but he very quickly decides to do because of his commitment to his profession. I also really liked the character of Akira, and while I thought her introduction was great, she again was in this movie for about 5 to 10 minutes and then was out for the rest of the film, which was disappointing because I'm like, if you're going to introduce a really good character that's very interesting, then you should put them in the movie for longer and develop them.
I will say I did really like the character interactions between Wick and a new character named Mr. Nobody. Not Nobody, but Mr. Nobody. And while it tried to flirt with some character building, it lacked any real depth. And I guess that was the problem that this movie had, was a lot of interesting characters with a lot of potential, but not a lot of actual depth.
But the thing I wanted to talk about most that really affected this movie for me was the Marquis de Bill Skarsgård. He is the main villain of this film, and he is not developed at all. It really felt like the old guard kind of villain, where it's like, okay, I understand that he is put in this position of power by the High Table, but there is absolutely nothing in this movie that shows me how he got there or why he was put in that position. He doesn't fight anybody. He doesn't outsmart anybody. We don't get to see how he's grown into this position of power. He just seems like a stuck-up, rich, spoiled brat and comes across as a super weak villain. A weak villain can be the downfall of a film, and that absolutely was the case here. So for me, character development gets a thumbs down. 5 is visuals and CGI. Just being completely upfront and honest, some of the CG in this movie was bad. During a couple different sequences, there was some dog CGI, there was some body CGI as people were getting hit by cars, but the action sequences were super cool. There's one sequence in particular, which I'm sure that the scene will be named Breath of the Dragon, that is super freaking cool, both in the way that it was shot and what happens during it. But on the other hand, I will say that there was one very cheesy villain that made you feel like you were just sitting there forever on this super long action sequence that was just dull and boring. So while the action sequences were well shot, there was a couple that I really liked, but there were others that I just felt were kind of empty and worthless. But for all intents and purposes, I have to give visuals and CGI a thumbs up. And 6 is rewatchability. John Wick Chapter 4 is 2 hours and 49 minutes long, and you definitely feel that runtime throughout this entire movie. With an extremely weak and unconvincing villain, paired with a cool but somewhat predictable ending, I'd say that John Wick Chapter 4 was honestly probably the weakest out of all 3. Pick number 3, my lord. So for me, rewatchability unfortunately gets a thumbs down. With all these areas considered, I have to give John Wick Chapter 4 a 6 out of 10. This movie had a couple really cool action sequences and interesting characters introduced that I wish we would have seen more of. But unfortunately, it had a weak and somewhat dull story, an extremely poor and underdeveloped villain, pacing issues and a couple useless action sequences, and a plot that made you feel like you were on a bunch of side quests that led to the final moment at the end is super underwhelming and disappointing. I just walked away from the movie wishing that there was so much more depth to the characters and the story, because this universe has so much potential and I just feel like they aren't using it that much. So with that being said, if you're a fan of the John Wick movies, you probably want to go watch this in theaters. But if you're just a casual enjoyer and you're somewhat on the fence, I actually wouldn't recommend going to watch this movie in theaters. Wait for it to come out on streaming services and then give it a look. Thank you so much for watching. If you've seen John Wick Chapter 4, please let me know what you thought about it in the comments below. As always, I appreciate your love and support, and I'll catch you guys and gals in the next one.